You probably think Harvard is the gold standard of higher learning, the oldest university in the United States, the birthplace of presidents, billionaires, and world leaders. Founded in 1636, held up as the pinnacle of intellectual achievement. But what if I told you 677 years before Harvard's gates ever opened, a Muslim woman had already built something far greater? Her name was Fatima al-Fihri, a woman in 9th century Morocco who, without armies, without political power, without even leaving her home city, laid the foundation for the world's very first degree-granting university. Not just a mosque, not just a school, but a structured institution of higher learning that produced scholars whose works shaped civilizations. And yet, how many of us were ever taught her name? In Fez, in the year 859, while much of Europe was struggling in what historians call the Dark Ages, Fatima al-Fihri stood before the foundations of Al-Qarawiyyin. She used her inheritance not for palaces or jewels, but as a waqf, an endowment dedicated purely to knowledge. This was not just charity, it was a vision so vast that it would ripple across continents for centuries. Harvard, Bologna, Oxford. All of them came later. Bologna was founded in 1088, Oxford in 1096, Harvard in 1636. Each claims prestige, each claims primacy, but none can deny that Fatima's institution predates them all. UNESCO itself confirms Al-Qarawiyyin is the oldest continually operating university in the world. Yet when you open a Western textbook, when you listen to the proud speeches of Harvard graduates, do you ever hear her name? Do you ever hear about the Muslim woman who gave the world its first model of a university? Number. Instead, silence. But silence is not accidental. History is written, and sometimes history is erased. Imagine this. A Muslim woman, veiled in dignity, standing in the heart of Fez, setting down the stones of an institution that would outlast empires, and imagine how threatening that image must be to a narrative that tells us progress came only from Europe, only from men, only from the West. Her story has been buried, but the stones of Qarawiyyin still stand. And if you walk into its courtyard today, you are walking into a living testimony that Harvard was not first. Oxford was not first. Fatima al-Fihri was first. Think about this. Fatima al-Fihri built a university before universities even had a name. Before the word university was ever spoken in Latin Europe, students were already studying astronomy, medicine, law, and theology under her endowment. And for over 12 centuries, that legacy has endured. So the question is not whether she existed. The question is why her name was erased. Because the real story of Fatima al-Fihri is not just about one woman building one university, it is about an entire civilization that gave the world knowledge, structure, and light, centuries before Europe caught up. But here's the hidden truth. Fatima's vision didn't emerge in isolation. It was born in the rich, vibrant context of the Islamic Golden Age, where cities like Fez became beacons of knowledge and migration. And that is where our story truly begins. That shocking revelation about Fatima al-Fihri was not an isolated miracle. Her vision grew from something far larger, the extraordinary world of the Islamic Golden Age. To understand her, we must first step into that world. Picture the year 800. In Baghdad, the great Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, buzzes with translators working late into the night, turning Greek, Persian, and Indian manuscripts into Arabic. In Cordoba, lamps light up the streets while most of Europe sleeps in darkness. And in North Africa, caravans pour wealth into Fez, a city about to become one of the beating hearts of global civilization. This is the environment in which Fatima al-Fihri was raised. Most people are taught that the Middle Ages were a time of ignorance and superstition. But that is only half the truth. While Europe struggled, the Muslim world thrived. Between the 8th and 12th centuries, Muslims produced breakthroughs in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, law, and philosophy. It was a world where scholars debated under mosque arches, where students memorized thousands of pages by heart, and where rulers competed to fund knowledge instead of wars. In Morocco, Fez stood out. Founded in 789 by Idris II, it quickly became a magnet for traders, artisans, and migrants. Families like Fatima's, originally from Kairouan in Tunisia, moved to Fez, seeking opportunity. The city swelled with Andalusian refugees, North African merchants, and scholars travelling from as far as Egypt and Al-Andalus. The air was thick with languages: Arabic, Berber, Latin, Hebrew, the sound of Quran recitation mixed with the hum of scholarly debate. And here lies a hidden fact. By the 9th century, Fez had become one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth. While Paris had perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, Fez may have held closer to 100,000. Its markets overflowed with silk from the east, gold from the Sahara, and books, yes, books copied by hand in numbers Europe would not see for centuries. This is where Fatima al-Fihri's dream took root. But here's what most people don't realise. The Islamic Golden Age was not just about collecting old wisdom, it was about transforming it. Muslim scholars didn't simply preserve Greek philosophy, they expanded it. Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra. Ibn Sina wrote the Canon of Medicine, a textbook used in Europe until the 17th century. Astronomers mapped the stars so precisely that even modern scientists are still impressed. And all of this knowledge would eventually flow into Europe, through Spain, Sicily, and the Crusades. Yet, when European historians later wrote their textbooks, they called this period the Dark Ages, and skipped over the brilliance that burned in Muslim lands. They praised Thomas Aquinas but forgot Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, who directly influenced him. They exalted Copernicus but ignored the Muslim astronomers whose charts he studied. They celebrated universities like Oxford and Bologna but erased the woman who created the model centuries earlier. Why? Because to admit the truth would shatter the myth of Western originality. Even today, if you ask a student in Boston where universities began, most will point to Harvard Yard. They have never heard of Fez, they have never heard of Al-Qarawiyyin, and they have certainly never heard of Fatima al-Fihri. But history leaves traces. In 1963, UNESCO officially recognized Al-Qarawiyyin as the world's oldest continually operating degree-granting university. In its archives, you can find references to centuries of scholarship carried out under its arches. And in Moroccan chronicles, Fatima al-Fihri's name is recorded with honour. A woman who dedicated her inheritance not to herself, but to the pursuit of knowledge. Still, the silence persists. Western encyclopedias often skip her name. Popular documentaries rarely mention her. School curriculums erase her entirely. It is as if the world cannot bear to accept that the mother of universities was not a European man, but a Muslim woman from North Africa. So let us set the record straight. The 9th century was no backwater. It was a golden thread in human history. And in Fez, one woman seized that moment to weave knowledge into the very fabric of civilization. But what kind of woman was Fatima al-Fihri? What led her to invest her fortune into a dream so vast, so unprecedented, that it would outlive dynasties and empires? That story, her personal journey from wealthy heiress to visionary founder, is even more astonishing than the world she lived in. And that story is where we turn next. That shocking question, what kind of woman was Fatima al-Fihri, takes us into the very heart of her story. Because to understand her legacy, we must first walk through the streets of Fez in the 9th century and stand beside her as she made one of the most extraordinary decisions in history. Fatima al-Fihri was born around the early 9th century in Kairouan in modern-day Tunisia. Her family, known for both piety and prosperity, migrated to Fez when she was still a child. Like many others, they sought the promise of Morocco's rising capital, a city that was swelling with migrants from Al-Andalus and North Africa. Her father, Mohammed al-Fihri, became a wealthy merchant in the city, trading in fine goods that travelled across the Mediterranean and Sahara. But wealth, as the Quran reminds us, is a test, and for Fatima, the test would come in the form of inheritance. When her father died, and soon after her husband as well, Fatima and her sister Mariam found themselves the heirs of considerable fortunes. Most women in their situation would have lived comfortably, building large homes, investing in trade or arranging marriages that secured alliances. But Fatima's heart was restless. One Moroccan chronicler records a remarkable vow she made. "I will build a house for God, spacious and enduring, and in it I will create a place of knowledge for all who seek it." Imagine that moment. A woman of means in a society where men dominated public life, standing before her community and declaring that she would dedicate her entire inheritance, not to family wealth, not to monuments of vanity, but to the pursuit of knowledge. But here's what most people don't realise. Fatima was not alone. Her sister Mariam shared her vision. Mariam founded the Grand Andalusian Mosque in Fez, while Fatima took on the even more ambitious task, building not just a mosque, but a learning institution that would nurture generations of scholars. Together, these two sisters left their mark on the very fabric of Fez. The construction began in the year 859. Fatima personally supervised the building of what would become Jami al-Qarawiyyin. Some reports say she even fasted daily during the long years of construction, breaking only at night, praying that Allah would bless her project with longevity. And He did. But let us pause here to consider what Fatima was truly creating. This was not just a mosque. It was a waqf, an Islamic charitable endowment. The concept of waqf is revolutionary. Once property or wealth is dedicated to it, it can never be sold, inherited, or squandered. It must forever serve the purpose for which it was given. In this case, Fatima's endowment was for knowledge. Her wealth became eternal. Through this system, generations of students would sit in circles under the mosque arches, learning Quran, Hadith, law, grammar, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. Teachers were supported, books were copied, and students were sheltered, all under the protection of Fatima's waqf. Think about it. A Muslim woman in the 9th century created a financial model so enduring that it would sustain the world's oldest university for over 1,200 years. Today, the concept of university endowments powers institutions like Harvard and Yale. Yet few realize that this idea, too, has Islamic roots planted by women like Fatima al-Fihri. One student of the time described the atmosphere inside Qarawiyyin. The mosque was filled with voices, some reciting Quran, others debating law, others studying the heavens. There was no silence, only the sound of knowledge being born. But the story of Qarawiyyin is not only about what was taught. It is about who was welcomed. From its earliest days, Qarawiyyin became a place where Muslims, Jews and Christians could learn side by side. The waqf did not discriminate. Knowledge was for all who sought it. Now here's a shocking fact. When Oxford was founded in 1096, its earliest colleges explicitly barred women and non-Christians. It took centuries before they opened their doors. Fatima's university, on the other hand, welcomed seekers of all backgrounds nearly 250 years earlier. Fatima herself never lived to see the full flowering of what she began. She passed away in Fez, but not before her dream had been firmly established. Today she is buried near the Qarawiyyin, and her name is still remembered in Moroccan tradition as al-Banat al-Ilm, the mother of the daughters of knowledge. But here's the tragedy. Outside of Morocco, her name fades into silence. You can read entire Western histories of education and never once encounter her story. So let us ask again, why has history erased her? Why has Harvard become a household name while Qarawiyyin, which predates it by nearly 7 centuries, is ignored? The answer lies in the legacy of what Fatima built. Because the institution she founded would not remain confined to Fez. Its influence would spread outward, through students, through books, through the great caravans of knowledge, until it shaped Europe itself. And that is where her story turns from remarkable to world-changing. Because what happened inside Qarawiyyin would ignite an intellectual chain reaction that reached from Morocco to Spain, from Spain to France and Italy, and from there across the entire Western world. And that journey, the legacy of knowledge birthed in Fatima's university, is what we uncover next. That journey, from Fatima al-Fihri's university in Fez to the very heart of Europe's intellectual awakening, begins with what happened inside the walls of Al-Qarawiyyin. Imagine walking into its courtyard in the 10th century. The arches echo with debate. A young student recites Quran with perfect tajwid, while across the courtyard, another copies a manuscript on astronomy. In one corner, a teacher explains Euclidean geometry, drawing lines in the dust with a stick. In another, a jurist argues points of fiqh with his students. The air is alive with knowledge. But here's what most people don't realize. Al-Qarawiyyin wasn't just a mosque. It was a complete curriculum centuries before Europe even had the word curriculum. Students studied Quran, Hadith, and Islamic law. But alongside that, they studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, logic, rhetoric, and even music. This was no narrow religious school. It was a universe of learning. Take medicine, for example. Students read the works of Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became the standard text in European universities for 600 years. Astronomers at Qarawiyyin refined calculations that later guided sailors like Christopher Columbus across the Atlantic. Mathematicians studied algebra and trigonometry centuries before Europe's so-called Renaissance. And then there were the towering scholars. Ibn Khaldun, the father of sociology and historiography, taught at Qarawiyyin. His Muqaddimah, written in the 14th century, analysed the rise and fall of civilizations with an insight so modern that many call him the first social scientist. Imagine a Muslim scholar centuries before Montesquieu or Adam Smith, explaining how economies grow, how dynasties collapse, and how power corrupts. And he was trained in the very system Fatima al-Fihri built. Another giant was Ibn Rushd, known as Averroes in Europe. A philosopher, jurist, and physician, his commentaries on Aristotle crossed from Arabic into Latin and shook Europe's intellectual world. Thomas Aquinas, the Catholic theologian, argued with Averroes in his writings. Dante, in his Divine Comedy, placed Averroes among the great spirits of history. And where did Averroes learn his foundations? In the scholarly networks rooted in North Africa, nourished by Qarawiyyin. Even Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and physician, studied within the intellectual ecosystem created by Fatima's endowment. His works would influence Jewish thought, Christian scholasticism, and Muslim philosophy alike. Here was a Muslim woman's legacy shaping not only Islam, but Judaism and Christianity as well, and still the textbooks rarely mention her. But let's get even more specific. How exactly did Europe receive this knowledge? The answer lies in translation. From the 10th to the 13th centuries, scholars flocked to Muslim Spain, especially Córdoba and Toledo, to translate Arabic manuscripts into Latin. These manuscripts, astronomy charts, medical encyclopedias, philosophical treatises, were often copied directly from works taught at Qarawiyyin. Jaber of Aurillac, who later became Pope Sylvester II, travelled to Muslim Spain in the 10th century and returned with knowledge of Arabic numerals and algebra. This pope, of all people, studied in circles connected to Fatima's university. Here's a shocking statistic. By the 12th century, Córdoba's libraries alone housed between 400,000 and 600,000 manuscripts. Paris, at the same time, had maybe a few dozen, and many of those Andalusian manuscripts had their origins in the learning centres of North Africa, especially Qarawiyyin. Think about that contrast. While European peasants struggled with famine and illiteracy, Muslim students in Fez were debating the orbits of planets and the properties of light. But the chain of transmission didn't end there. As crusaders stormed into Muslim lands, they didn't just take territory, they took books. Libraries in Andalusia, Sicily, and North Africa were looted, their treasures carted back to Europe. These texts entered European universities, often stripped of their original authors' names, their Muslim origins erased. Ideas were carried west, but the memory of their source was deliberately buried. And yet, despite this erasure, the influence is undeniable. Look closely at the foundation of Europe's universities. Bologna, founded in 1088, modelled itself on institutions like Qarawiyyin and Al-Azhar. Oxford, in 1096, introduced structured lectures and disputations borrowed from Muslim teaching methods. Even the concept of granting degrees, a formal recognition of scholarly achievement, emerged from the system Fatima established. But here's what shocks historians most. The first time the word universitas appears in Europe, the structure it describes was already alive and flourishing in Fez. In other words, Europe did not invent the university. It inherited the model from a Muslim woman. The historian George Makdisi has argued forcefully that Islamic institutions pioneered concepts like the lecture, majlis, the professor's certificate, ijazah, and the endowed college, madrasa, all of which Europe later adopted. Yet, when we open Western textbooks, we are told the story begins with Bologna or Oxford, as if nothing existed before. Why? Because acknowledging Fatima al-Fihri would rewrite the very foundation of Western pride. So let us be clear, without Fatima, there is no Bologna. Without Fatima, there is no Oxford. Without Fatima, there is no Harvard. Her legacy is the hidden root of the modern university system. But if Qarawiyyin shaped Europe so profoundly, why is Fatima's name almost never mentioned? Why do we celebrate Harvard's prestige while forgetting the woman who lit the torch centuries earlier? The answer lies not only in the brilliance of her institution, but in the deliberate erasure that came later. For as Europe rose, it claimed the fruits of Muslim knowledge while severing the roots. And that story, the story of how Western institutions rose on the shoulders of Fatima al-Fihri's model while erasing her name, is where we must turn next. Because what happened after Qarawiyyin's knowledge flowed westward would shock even the most hardened historians. That shocking revelation that Europe's universities rose on the shoulders of Fatima al-Fihri's model forces us to ask, if she gave the world its first university, why is her name missing from the narrative? The answer is as disturbing as it is deliberate. Let's begin with the timeline. Al-Qarawiyyin was founded in 859 in Fez. Bologna followed in 1088, Oxford in 1096, Cambridge in 1209, and Harvard in 1636. That's nearly 800 years after Fatima's institution opened its doors. UNESCO and Guinness World Records both recognise Qarawiyyin as the world's oldest continuously operating university. These are not claims, they are documented facts. And yet, ask a Harvard graduate about the first university, and most will point proudly to their alma mater or to Oxford. Few, if any, will utter the name of Fatima al-Fihri. Why? Because history has been rewritten. Here's what most people don't realise. Europe didn't just borrow knowledge from the Muslim world. It systematically absorbed, repackaged, and then erased its origins. During the Crusades and the Reconquista, libraries in Andalusia and North Africa were seized. Thousands of Arabic manuscripts were translated into Latin, but the translators often omitted the authors' names. Ibn Sina became Avicenna, Ibn Rushd became Averroes. Al-Khwarizmi, the father of algebra, gave his name to algorithms, but his Muslim identity was buried beneath Latinized distortions. The same fate met Fatima al-Fihri. Western histories of education celebrated Bologna and Paris, but ignored the institution that inspired them both. Consider this. When the University of Bologna began teaching Roman law in the 11th century, its structure, the lecture, the disputation, the granting of degrees, was modelled on practices long established in Muslim madrasas like Qarawiyyin. When Oxford opened, it introduced the bachelor's degree and master's degree, terms directly echoing the Muslim ijaza system, where a student received written certification from a teacher to transmit knowledge. And yet, no plaque, no textbook, no proud lecture acknowledged that these concepts originated in the Islamic world, let alone with a Muslim woman. Why? Because the rise of Europe was not just about learning, it was about power. And to consolidate power, Europe needed to craft a story where it, and it alone, was the source of civilization. Think about this statistic. By the 12th century, the Muslim world boasted dozens of advanced learning centres: Qarawiyyin in Fez, Al-Azhar in Cairo, Cordoba in Spain. Europe had none, but within 3 centuries Europe claimed the invention of the university and erased its Muslim predecessors. This wasn't an accident, it was a narrative strategy. Take Harvard, for example. Founded in 1636, it calls itself the oldest institution of higher learning in the United States. That much is true, but Harvard alumni and publications often push a deeper claim, that Harvard is among the oldest universities in the world. That claim collapses instantly when compared to Qarawiyyin, which is not only older, but still operating today. The irony is staggering. Harvard's endowment today exceeds $50 billion, making it the richest university on earth. Yet the very model of an endowment was pioneered by Fatima al-Fihri's Waqf. Harvard thrives on the shadow of a system created 800 years earlier by a Muslim woman. And here is the cruelest twist. While Fatima's university educated Muslims, Jews, and Christians side by side, Harvard would not admit women until 1920, over 1,000 years after Fatima endowed her institution. Think about that. The first university in history was founded by a woman, but the so-called leaders of modern education excluded women for centuries. But the erasure runs deeper than institutional pride. It ties into colonial narratives. When European powers colonized Muslim lands in the 19th and 20th centuries, they rewrote local histories. Textbooks in French Morocco, British Egypt, and Ottoman Turkey were redesigned to glorify European achievements and minimize Islamic ones. Fatima al-Fihri's name was pushed to the margins, while European figures were elevated as civilizers. This is why today millions know the name Harvard, but only a handful know Qarawiyyin. It is not ignorance by accident, it is ignorance by design. Yet history leaves traces. The Moroccan historian Ibn Abi Zar, in his Rawd al-Qirtas, praises Fatima as a woman of piety, intelligence and vision, whose charity has outlived dynasties. UNESCO, in its official documents, recognises Qarawiyyin as the first university. And in 2021, the Moroccan government restored parts of the university, declaring it a global heritage site. Slowly, the truth is resurfacing. But let us not forget the cost of this erasure. Generations of Muslim children grew up believing that Europe invented the university, that their civilization contributed little beyond war and conquest. Women, in particular, were told their place was passive, when in reality the very foundation of global education rests on the shoulders of a Muslim woman. So here is the shocking truth. Every time a student steps into Harvard Yard, every time a lecture begins at Oxford, every time a degree is conferred in Bologna, they are walking in the footsteps of Fatima al-Fihri, even if they do not know her name. But the real power of her legacy is not just in structures or systems, it is in people. The men and women whose lives were transformed by Qarawiyyin, whose ideas spread across the world, shaping everything from philosophy to science to law. And those human stories, the scholars, the students, the seekers, are the living proof of Fatima's vision. So let us now meet them. Let us enter their world and see how one woman's dream in Fez changed the lives of countless generations. Because the story of Fatima al-Fihri is not just about buildings, it is about people. And their stories will shock you even more. The stones of Al-Qarawiyyin still stand, weathered by 12 centuries of wind and rain. But its true legacy is not in stone. It is in people. Living minds, breathing hearts, generations whose lives were transformed by the vision of a Muslim woman in 9th century Fez. Picture the courtyard of Qarawiyyin 1,000 years ago. A circle of students gathers around a teacher, ink-stained manuscripts spread before them. The sound of Quran recitation drifts from one side, while on another a fiery debate about Aristotle ignites. These are not nameless students. Some of them would change the course of human history. Take Ibn Khaldun. Born in 1332, he became one of the greatest minds humanity has ever produced. His monumental work, Al-Muqaddimah, laid out a philosophy of history, economics and sociology centuries before Europe coined those disciplines. He analysed how dynasties rise and fall, how power corrupts, how climate and geography shape human societies. Modern scholars at Princeton and Cambridge still quote him as the father of sociology. And where did he study? In the intellectual world created by Fatima al-Fihri's endowment, nourished by Qarawiyyin's traditions. Or consider Ibn Rushd, known in Europe as Averroes. Philosopher, jurist and physician, he wrote detailed commentaries on Aristotle that shook European thought to its core. Thomas Aquinas, the giant of Christian theology, debated with Averroes through the pages of his own writings. European scholars called him the commentator because his work became the standard bridge between ancient philosophy and medieval Europe. Without Ibn Rushd, the Renaissance might never have happened. And without the system that Fatima al-Fihri created, Ibn Rushd's path might never have opened. But Qarawiyyin's influence did not stop with Muslims. It became a meeting ground for faiths. Maimonides, the Jewish philosopher and physician, walked the same intellectual pathways. His guide for the perplexed shaped Jewish thought for centuries and even influenced Christian theology. His training in the intellectual ecosystem of North Africa, tied to Qarawiyyin's networks, proves a staggering truth. Fatima's university was never for Muslims alone. It was for all seekers of knowledge. Even Christian Europe could not resist. In the 10th century, Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II, travelled to Muslim Spain. He studied Arabic mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, knowledge transmitted from Qarawiyyin and other centres. Returning to France, he introduced the decimal system and the concept of zero to Europe. Think about that. A pope who studied with Muslim scholars carrying ideas rooted in Fatima's vision into the heart of Christian Europe. And here's a shocking statistic. By the 12th century, Fez had one of the largest libraries in the world. Some estimates suggest that Muslim Spain and North Africa together housed over 400,000 manuscripts, while Paris, at the same time, held fewer than 100. Europe's scholars had to travel south if they wanted access to books. Qarawiyyin was the doorway. But the impact was not just intellectual, it was personal. Imagine the young student arriving from Andalusia, dusty from travel, walking into the courtyard of Qarawiyyin for the first time. He hears accents from across the Muslim world. Egyptians, Berbers, Syrians, Persians, all debating. For the first time in his life, he sees a true international community of learning. He writes home to his family, describing Fez as a sea of knowledge whose waves never rest. Or imagine the daughter of a merchant quietly listening in the women's section of the mosque. Though history rarely records their names, women attended lessons, memorized Quran, and even received ijazat, certifications to teach. Fatima al-Fihri's example opened doors for countless women whose voices were silenced by later historians. Here's another fact. Qarawiyyin was one of the first institutions to welcome foreign students. By the 13th century, its graduates included scholars from Spain, West Africa, Egypt, and beyond. Knowledge radiated outward, carried on caravans across the Sahara and on ships across the Mediterranean. A legal ruling given in Fez might shape trade in Timbuktu. A medical treatise copied in Qarawiyyin might find its way to Sicily. This is the human chain of Fatima's vision. Not just scholars, but merchants, rulers, physicians, and ordinary students whose lives were elevated by access to knowledge. Yet for every life Qarawiyyin lifted, there is also the tragedy of forgetting. For centuries, these human impact stories were celebrated in Muslim chronicles, but ignored in Western ones. When European textbooks told of the Renaissance, they credited Petrarch, Galileo, and Copernicus. They rarely mentioned Ibn Khaldun, Ibn Rushd, or Maimonides, men whose intellectual roots traced directly to Qarawiyyin. The silence is deafening, but the evidence is undeniable. So the human impact of Fatima al-Fihri's university is this. A Muslim woman's generosity birthed generations of thinkers who shaped philosophy, science, medicine, law, and even theology across 3 faiths and 2 continents. She didn't just build a building. She ignited a chain reaction that changed humanity. But the real question is this. If her impact was so great, why did her name, and the name of Qarawiyyin, vanish from the story told in modern textbooks? The answer lies in the hidden consequences of power, patriarchy, and colonialism. The deliberate erasure of Fatima's legacy is as much a story as the legacy itself. And that hidden erasure, the theft of memory, the silence imposed on Muslim contributions is where we turn next. Because what happened to Fatima's name after her death would shock you even more than what she built in her lifetime. Her legacy should have been untouchable. After all, who could deny the stones of Al-Qarawiyyin? Who could erase 12 centuries of learning? Yet what happened after Fatima al-Fihri's death is one of the most tragic examples of how history is not just remembered, it is rewritten. Because while her institution lived, her name began to disappear. Let us start with a simple fact. When you open a European history textbook, you are told that universities began in Bologna in 1088 or Oxford in 1096. Some even call Harvard, founded in 1636, the first modern university. But Qarawiyyin, founded in 859, is almost never mentioned, and Fatima al-Fihri, the woman behind it, is completely absent. How could this be? The answer lies in what scholars call Orientalism, the systematic rewriting of history to serve European pride. When Crusaders entered Muslim lands, they took not only treasures but books. Thousands of Arabic manuscripts were translated into Latin, but the translators often removed Muslim names. Ibn Sina became Avicenna. Ibn Rushd became Averroes. Al-Khwarizmi, whose algebra changed the world, became a shadow in the word algorithm. Names were Latinized, origins blurred, and the story of Islamic genius was rebranded as European discovery. Fatima al-Fihri suffered the greatest erasure of all. As a Muslim woman, she did not fit into the narrative of European superiority. A woman founding the world's first university centuries before Europe, that fact was too disruptive, so she vanished from the story. But here's what most people don't realize. This erasure was not only intellectual, it was also colonial. When European empires colonized Muslim lands in the 19th and 20th centuries, they controlled not just armies, but schools. French colonial authorities in Morocco rewrote textbooks to glorify French civilizing missions. They presented Europe as the teacher of the world, not the student. The names of Muslim scholars were reduced, minimized, or erased altogether. Moroccan children grew up learning about Napoleon, but not about Fatima al-Fihri. And then there is patriarchy. For centuries, even within Muslim societies, women's contributions were systematically downplayed. Male chroniclers recorded kings, generals, and jurists. Women like Fatima, who wielded influence not through politics but through piety and philanthropy, were often pushed to the margins. Even when her name was preserved in Moroccan chronicles like Raud al-Qirtas, it remained largely unknown beyond local history. The consequences of this silence are staggering. Imagine, 1 billion Muslims today, yet how many know that the mother of universities was one of their own? Millions of women searching for role models in history, yet how many are ever told Fatima's name? Here is a shocking comparison. Harvard's name is known in every corner of the earth. In 2023 alone, its endowment reached $53 billion, larger than the GDP of some nations. Its alumni include 8 US presidents and more than 150 Nobel laureates. But Qarawiyyin, with its 1,200-year head start, is almost invisible in global consciousness. This is not because it failed. It is because it was buried under colonial narratives, buried under Orientalist distortions, buried under patriarchal silences, and yet history leaves traces. UNESCO in 1963 recognized Qarawiyyin as the world's oldest operating degree-granting university. Moroccan historians preserved Fatima's name, and Muslim oral traditions carried her story across generations. Like a flame hidden under ashes, her legacy has never fully died. But the question remains, why does this erasure matter? Some might say, who cares who built the first university? We have universities now. But this is not just about trivia, this is about power. Because when a civilization is told that it contributed nothing to human progress, that its golden age was a myth, that it has always been a student and never a teacher, it begins to believe it. Colonial powers understood this well. Erase the memory of Fatima al-Fihri, and you erase Muslim pride and intellectual heritage. Replace her with Harvard, Oxford, and Bologna, and you reinforce the myth of Western superiority. This was not an accident, it was a strategy. But the truth cannot remain hidden forever. In recent decades, Muslim scholars and post-colonial historians have begun to restore Fatima al-Fihri to her rightful place. Books, academic papers, and even UNESCO records now highlight her as the founder of the first university. In Fez, her story is proudly told again. Slowly, her name is resurfacing from the shadows. And yet, the damage is not fully undone. Walk into a classroom in London, Paris, or Boston, and you will still hear about Oxford and Harvard long before you hear about Qarawiyyin. Western museums still showcase Renaissance discoveries while ignoring the manuscripts of Muslim scholars that fueled them. And Fatima al-Fihri, this extraordinary woman, is still missing from the narrative taught to millions. So the hidden consequence of her story is this. Not only did Europe erase her name, but generations of Muslims grew up without knowing that the world's first university came from their own tradition, from their own history, from a woman who lived and died in service of knowledge. But the tide is turning. The rise of movements to decolonize education, to re-center erased voices, to celebrate women in history, these are bringing Fatima back into the light. Her story is not just being remembered, it is being reclaimed. And that brings us to today. Because her vision did not end in the 9th century. It is alive in every lecture hall, in every endowment fund, in every young woman who dares to step into leadership in education. The question is no longer whether Fatima al-Fihri existed. The question is, how do we honour her now? To answer that, we must look at the modern world, because her story is not only about the past, it is about the present and the future. And the connections between Fatima al-Fihri's legacy and today's universities will astonish you. That astonishing truth that Fatima al-Fihri's legacy was buried but not destroyed leads us to the modern world. Because her vision is not just history, it is alive today in ways most people never realise. Step into Fez right now and you will find Al-Qarawiyyin still standing. Over 1,160 years after Fatima laid its foundations, classes are still held within its walls. Students still memorise Quran, still debate law, still study language and science. Imagine that, an institution older than Oxford, older than Bologna, older than Harvard, still operating as a living university. No other institution on earth can claim that. But here's what most people don't realise. The very model Fatima pioneered, the university endowment, is now at the heart of the world's most prestigious institutions. Harvard's $53 billion endowment, Yale's $42 billion, Oxford's billions, all follow the concept of waqf that Fatima used in 859. A Muslim woman created the structure that sustains modern academia. Harvard's wealth today is Fatima's echo, and there is more. In recent years, movements to decolonize education have begun to shine a light on erased histories. Scholars now point out that the idea of the first university cannot belong to Bologna or Oxford. UNESCO has made it official. Al-Qarawiyyin is the oldest continuously operating degree-granting university in the world. Slowly, Western academia is being forced to acknowledge what was hidden. At the same time, Muslim women are reclaiming Fatima's role as a model of empowerment. Across the Muslim world, from Indonesia to Egypt to Nigeria, women lead schools, universities, and research centres. They see in Fatima not just a historical figure, but a living inspiration, proof that leadership in knowledge is part of their heritage. Here's a statistic to prove the point. In countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Malaysia, more than 50% of university students today are women. This fact shocks many who believe Muslim women have always been excluded from education. But Fatima al-Fihri's example shows that women in Islam have always had the right and the ability to lead in knowledge. And then there is Harvard itself. In 2019, during a global conference, Harvard scholars quietly acknowledged the existence of Al-Qarawiyyin. They could no longer deny it, but rarely do they say the full truth, that their institution is modelled on one founded by a Muslim woman centuries earlier. The silence still lingers, yet the silence is breaking. Documentaries, academic papers, and even social media campaigns are reviving Fatima's story. Young Muslims now share her legacy online, reclaiming pride in their intellectual heritage. In Morocco, her name is spoken with reverence again, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. But the deeper question remains. What will we do with this knowledge? Will Fatima remain a rediscovered curiosity, or will her story reshape how we think about the history of learning? Will Harvard and Oxford continue to hold the spotlight, or will Muslims reclaim their rightful place as founders of global education? Fatima al-Fihri is not just a woman of the past, she is a challenge to the present. Her life asks us, what are you building with your wealth? What are you leaving behind for future generations? Her waqf still speaks. Knowledge is eternal. Charity is eternal. Legacy is eternal. And this is why her story matters now more than ever. Because in a world still divided by ignorance, prejudice and erasure, Fatima's life is proof that Muslims were not merely receivers of civilization. They were givers. They were builders. They were teachers. But the real power of her story is not in Fez alone. It is in the inspiration she offers to every Muslim woman, every young student, every believer who dares to dream of building something that will outlast empires. So, as we stand in the modern world with Fatima's vision still alive, we must ask, how do we carry it forward? And to answer that, we must end with the truth most people still don't know. The truth that before Harvard, before Oxford, before Bologna, there was a Muslim woman. Before Harvard, before Oxford, before Bologna, there was a Muslim woman. Her name was Fatima al-Fihri. For too long, her story was buried under centuries of silence. For too long, the narrative of universities has been told as if they were born in Europe, as if knowledge itself had no roots in the Muslim world. But now, the truth can no longer be denied. Fatima al-Fihri's legacy is not a relic of the past. It is the living foundation of every university in the world today. Every degree conferred, every lecture delivered, every endowment fund established carries within it an echo of her vision. She built a model so powerful that it outlived dynasties, empires, and even the erasure of her name. But here's what most people don't realize. Her story is not just about the past. It is about the future. In an age where Muslim contributions are often dismissed, in a time when Muslim women are too often portrayed as silent, Fatima al-Fihri's life stands as a rebuke. She was not silent. She was not passive. She was a builder of worlds. So what do we do with her story? We reclaim it. We teach it to our children. We honour it in our classrooms. We remind the world that the mother of universities was not a European man, but a Muslim woman from Fez. And we ask ourselves, what waqf will we leave behind? What knowledge, what institutions, what legacies will outlive us? Fatima al-Fihri gave everything she had for a dream of education that would last more than a millennium. What will we give? Her name, once silenced, is rising again, and her message is clear. Knowledge is power, legacy is eternal, and truth cannot be erased forever. So let the world remember. Before Harvard, before Oxford, before Bologna, there was Fatima al-Fihri, the woman who built the first university, the woman whose vision lit the path for all who came after, the woman whose legacy still speaks across 12 centuries. Iqra, read, learn, build. But the real question is this: will we listen? Will we carry her torch into the future? Or will we allow her story to be buried once again? The answer lies not in the past, but in us.